Okay, it's my great honor to introduce this last lecture of the day. And Jim Heckman will be talking and joint with Jin Zhao. And so we look forward to hearing more about early childhood interventions and human capital.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. I'm afraid I may overstay my welcome in the sense that we're going to repeat some material, but we're also going to provide some background. And I think given that this is more of a tutorial than a lecture to start, breaking new ground, what we're going to present is some material from a previous paper that motivated the paper that we gave Thursday. And then we're going to talk about we're going to review some of the results on the paper Thursday, building on this background. And then we're going to talk about some general discussions and estimates that we didn't discuss at all on Thursday that provide a more of a model comparison between the particular model we fit and some of the other model specifications and how well these alternative models explain the data, how interpretable they are, and what the limitations are. So since this is the summer school, I think it's useful frequently for students and for people who are not familiar with the structure of research or haven't done a lot of it to see how dirty research can really be and what the guts are of trying to get to a paper that's any good. And we're in the middle of finishing that paper we gave. So let me just talk briefly about this program that we discussed Thursday. And this was the China REACH program. And we discussed it already in some detail. And I gather, given the methodological focus here in the seminar and in the summer school, we're not going to really be all that interesting to people who are interested, unless they're really interested in China. However, this program has some very interesting features. And many of you will have heard about these early childhood programs. But these early childhood programs generally have a feature of, there's a lot of discussion around it. I would say boilerplate, and maybe even a lot of acquired wisdom and acquired, I would say, barnacles that come from these programs being, many of them now 50, 60 years old. And what we're really trying to think of is most effective way to develop children and to provide them with the early skill base. I think we've generally accepted the notion that the early childhood years are very important. And there's a growing body of research now, both in economics and of course in epidemiology and in many other fields, in biology in particular, but certainly in sociology and public policy, looking at the impact of various programs on reporting treatment effects. And so this program is designed to sort of go beyond that and to ask, well, what features of these programs are effective and how can we investigate the structure of these models? So can we go beyond reporting age and treatment on the treated? And the kind of typical material you'll see published in some of the so-called leading journals that are heavily interested. Imbens has this paper where he denotes a certain cynicism or suggests a certain cynicism about trying to go deeper into these matters. And I think he has something like, it's called Better Late Than Nothing. It's a comment on a paper that I wrote with Ertsua on structural models. And I think maybe we're going to see that we can go beyond this kind of mechanical treatment effect approach and go deeper in understanding what they are. So we already talked about this program. This program is valuable scientifically because it's isolating a component of what appears in many of the other programs that have been put forward in the literature. So for example, the famous Perry preschool program and the program ABC and so forth, all of those programs have many, many features. Children go to these centers. They are there for various times, between 4 hours a day and 8 hours a day. And there'll be all kinds of activities. There's a program near me here in a Black neighborhood, just maybe a mile or two from here, where the children are given a very, very rich environment, a nurse, computer facilities, $30,000 a year per child is spent on those programs. Now, those programs do everything. They teach reading, they do play, but what hasn't been isolated is exactly what feature of those programs is really being successful. What is producing the result that comes out of these programs? There have been these effects, although only recently have there been long-term evaluations of these effects of these programs. One of the problems, of course, with the treatment effect literature and a lot of the experimental literature, especially on human skill formation, has been the short-run nature of the follow-ups. You'll see amazing papers saying, "Oh, look, the skills of the child went up in, it went up a huge fold in a very short space of time, and we've raised their IQ to the level of the normal among, say, dull normal children, and this is great." And then there's this literature that's followed called fade out, which claims that all these early beneficial effects fade out, and there is no lasting effect of these programs. Now, I make 2 points. One is that that claim is wrong. We've had data now. We followed people up into the 60s or late 50s in the case of Perry, and we see lasting effects on IQ, health, and a number of other components of dimensions, including cognitive, as well as education, participation in criminal activity, social engagement, parenting, and so forth. And we even found in the Perry program effects that went into the second generation. The children in the Perry study that we looked at were 50s. They now had children in their 20s and 30s, and we could actually look at the second generation impacts, which were substantial on those programs. So that some of the folklore surrounding these programs, and there's a lot of it, really is wrong. People talking about fade out. But more importantly, for the purpose of this seminar, the mechanisms producing these programs really aren't carefully studied. And there's a view that somehow, we throw a little bit here, it's a shotgun. We do this, we do that. And in fact, there are all these people who have these curricula, very rigid curricula, sometimes hundreds of pages. Do this, do that. There's this fanatic in Denver named David Olds, who runs a program called Nurse Family Partnership. And he insists that, it's a home visit, but he insists that nurses in those programs be trained in his center in Denver, and they follow a certain rigid protocol. And so what comes out of it is a bunch of different things going on without any clear understanding. What really attracted us to these programs, in addition to the intrinsic interest in China, was the question about we could isolate with the Jamaican programs that are the core, the paradigm of what's going on. And Orazio's work has also been using this Jamaican REACH program, but also looking at home visiting as the main component. And by that, we mean people who are coming maybe from a center, but going to the home and working with the parent and teaching parents things that they don't know. Now, one of the most interesting things, some of the work of Flavio Cunha, which I think is extremely interesting and early and very pioneering, a number of areas, documents how disadvantaged parents don't know some of the very basics about child rearing. They don't know what a normal growth trajectory is. And so this notion of working with the parent and advising them on how to improve and interact with their children is really important. And it isolates what I think is a big component. And the reason why I say it's a big component, I'm not going to show you a slide on this, but in previous work, we've noticed that one of the main ingredients of those successful programs, when we've been able to measure it, has been enhanced parental engagement with the child. And so even though in the Perry program and then the ABC program and some of these other programs, we see all these effects, what we also see is the parents are more actively engaged with the child and changing the parenting strategy. And so the notion of this program is to go right to the chase, cut to the chase, and look at the component of visiting and teaching the parents how to interact with the child. And instead of having a full day, week-long program, which is typical of many of these programs, or at least half day, what we found is the visits are basically 1 hour a week, if that, and done over a limited period of time. So I won't be able to give you long-term follow-up of this program today. But what we do see is a tremendous change in the way that parenting is going on. And we'll document that. We talked a little bit about that before. So I would say scientifically, it's a little bit, I don't want to be too self-serving here, but I like to think of Madame Curie isolating radium from pitchblende. What we're doing is we're extracting what we think of as the essence of the underlying structure of what these programs do, and they turn on parents. And we want to see exactly how that works and whether or not that works. Okay, so let me just get to work. This interview, I mean, this program is conducted in rural China. And if you've seen maps of Xinjiang and all the discussions about what's going on there, you realize this province, which is shaded here in red, is one of the poorest areas in China. And it's right next to Xinjiang, but it's Han Chinese. There's no minority issue here in this town, in this province, but it's extremely poor, and it's remarked to be poor by everyone who visits it. One thing that's interesting and important is that about 40% of the fathers work outside the county, and many of the mothers do as well. This has been one of the great sources of growth of the Chinese economy, that they've been able to actually produce, to send children to the parents coming in from the countryside. And there's been an almost unlimited supply of labor, and that unlimited supply of labor has gone to the east where the factories are and has helped China develop. But it's also created a huge amount of regional inequality and inequality in the sense of the child rearing environments. And many times when the children are left behind, when the parents go to the east, they're being raised by their grandmothers. And in China, there's some strong intergenerational effects. So by that, I mean that years of education of average grandmothers, 3 years. And many don't have any formal education at all. Not only are they from an earlier generation, but many of them are also rural on top of it. So anyway, the randomization design we discussed last time, it's a village level randomization. So we're constructing villages, pairing villages, and we're using this non-bipart Mahalanobis metric to essentially look at assessments among similarities of villages. And we randomly, once we find a pair, we randomly select one village within a pair into treatment and another into control. And there's generally 100% participation in the treatment groups. There isn't an issue about take-up. It's enthusiastically received everywhere. And here we can actually get an idea of how well the experiment is. The vast majority are pretty close matches. However, the scale is meaningless, so maybe, but there are some distant matches, and we do adjust the data to trim those out and see how sensitive those distant matches are. And we can then do the usual stuff. I'm not going to bore you with the notion. We have then all the issues that come with paired treatment effects. We have all the issues that come with the fact that there is a village, there's strong village effects, and we need to account for that. And we do that in creating standard errors, because there is going to be kind of community effects that need to be controlled for. And so that's the nature of the home visiting program. I don't want to go into it, but there are two sets of actors here. In addition to the family with their children, there's also a home visitor who's roughly of the same level of education as the mother who's away. So which means they're kind of middle years of high school. They're not PhDs, they're not DAs, they're middle level people. And for supervisors, what we see is these are more educated people. These are the ones who train the visitors. And they visit the homes and take occasional supplements and look at the underlying practice of the visitor in the home. So that gives us not only information on the child as directly determined from the visitor, but information on the visitor as determined by his or her interactions and visits to the home. And so what's happening is there are a bunch of different skills that are being focused on. And I'm going to focus primarily on these cognitive skills, fine motor skills, language skills, social and emotional skills are more like self-control. But these are well defined, and we talked about some of those last time. So what we do is we have, and this is the conventional part, which motivated what we did yesterday. And that is, The Denver test is a test of, which is the usual kind of test. There are a lot of different tasks that children have to be performed. There are 125 tasks. There are 4 aspects of skill measurement. And so the usual kind of assessments are occurring on these tests, and the kids are in. And so I'm not going to go through this, but we can actually see how over years, this is the level of difficulty. There's a ladder-like increase, and the children are getting more and more inference on the underlying, the skill level is actually increasing in each of these different measures. There's 4 different skills that we're talking about the growth pattern of. So the standard approach is equation 1, and I'm not going to bore you with it. We have a randomized trial. We have full compliance, so also compliance issues aren't so important. Very little attrition. This is also in rural China, and there's a lot of kind of, I would say, collective efficacy, to use Rob Sampson's term, which somehow polices some compliance with these protocols. So equations 1 and 2 are the usual, that we have randomization conditional on a set of variables, pretreatment variables, and that gives us the boilerplate treatment effect model. And we're basically assuming independence after we condition within the block. But there's a block diagonal covariant structure with each village having a separate block. And so when we prepare standard errors, we do basically some wild bootstrap estimates in order to gain some structure of compliance. Sorry about these, a couple of double question marks around here that came. This is something I thought I avoided, but I didn't. Anyway, these are the standard treatment effects, and this is what you see in the literature. This is the lifeblood of the AER, the QJE, and a lot of other places. This is telling you what is the treatment effect. And you can see that at the midline and at the end line of this survey, you get substantial effects in terms of effect sizes. These are standard effect sizes, standardized by the standard deviation of the test score that's being used in the baseline group. And so we basically get that some results that are similar to what we talked about before. We can also compute village level treatment effects. That's not so important. But here I want to talk about the mechanics of trying to go underneath those treatment effects. And here the question is, what's the source of the treatment effects? And to do that, we build a model, a very simple model that actually extends, but it's not truly revolutionary in the educational testing literature. There's a great book. I actually happen to have it right here on my shelf by a guy named van der Linden, and it's called Item Response Theory. And it's a whole structure of models that are used in the educational response models. And we drew on those and extended those in various ways to try to give some interpretable framework. This model actually is not in that book, but it's clearly influenced by the models. And so what we imagine is something, again, a threshold crossing model like Thursday. We observe test scores. We observe test scores, in this case, only at 2 points of time, midline and then inline, okay? So we have a treatment and control group. But what we're going to do is develop this model. Now, this is not a very rich economic model, but it's a rich interpretive model in terms of the production technology of skills. And this builds on some previous work that I did with Flavio and Shinak, and then later worked Pinto and Savalia. And what we do is basically build this model, which is a latent variable model, asking whether on a given item of a test, think of an item as a particular question, an item on a test, say of cognition, the individual can pass the test. Do they show competence? And so you get this index crossing threshold index model here. And the crucial thing is this parameterization. And the new part about this, relative to much of the literature, although it's there in the literature, it's definitely there in the RASH model literature, is the notion of an item difficulty level. And so literally, as the item difficulty level gets smaller and smaller, it's harder and harder to pass the test. And so this is a way that adjusts the items. And so there are a series of items on these given tests and those are then going to be adjusted. And then we have this notion that the treatment effect can operate through changing a latent skill factor, which we're going to identify, and then the map of the skills to the out latent variable here. So there are a bunch of latent variables floating around here. There's theta, there's alpha. We don't measure that theta directly, but we have a whole bunch of measurements on those thetas, right? And we also then need to estimate the alpha, which is showing us how the theta is mapped in to the latent variable. And then, of course, the latent variable crossing the threshold. So there's some normalization issues that are essential in making this model feasible. So what do we have then? The delta J parameter is the difficulty item, and the level is going to be an n by k vector, n sub I. Alpha is going to be a k by n sub j vector of loadings on the skill factor. So D is controlled, one is the treatment group. And unlike the rash model, which is really for a single skill, what we have is actually multiple skills, and we add the difficulty levels, although difficulty levels have surely been added to rash models in the past. So this is basically the standard econometric model, which is itself hopelessly under-identified. So we have to make some assumptions. And it's those assumptions which we're going to take into account when we discuss our later work. But here it is. This is the mapping that I talked about before. And the idea is, what can you recover? And remember, we have different tasks. So we have different skills. We have these different set of skills that I showed you. And then on each of those skills, we have a bunch of tests of those skills. And then we also then can measure things like characteristics of the family. This is all a very, very econometric looking framework and so forth. So what does the intervention do? That you can think of the intervention as shaping these skills. And these skills, by the way, are useful across all these different tasks. That's the crucial thing, that we're going to have a bunch of different tasks. And that's going to give us some important identification. And then we're also going to get this map that goes from factor loading that goes. So the intervention can shift this and can also shift this map. And the question is, what's the relative importance of those two? This is the kind of question that I considered earlier in this paper with Carnero, not with Carnero, sorry, with Savalyev and with Rodrigo Pinto. And we're going to look at it here as well. So you can think of it another way, is that basically these are skill enhancement parameters themselves. And this is a bundle of effective skills. That's going to be a lot easier to identify that bundle than the individual components that we'll see. So the point is that we can basically identify the individual latent factors and not just the distribution of the factors. We have this very long panel, and we can then follow. We have many different items. I call it a panel, but what it is many items across many individuals. And so what we have is a number of individuals going to infinity and the number of items going to infinity, but we're going to assume that the ratio here converges to some constant. This thing is going to like 1,500. We have 1,500 of these in practice, and we can draw on some earlier work by Fernandez, Val, and Weidner, showing how this, how to actually get the individual factors. So this is more than just isolating the distribution; it's isolating the individual factor, and we can confirm that their conditions apply in our sample.
Jim, can I ask you a question here? In your model, you allow the factor loadings to depend on the treatment. That seems kind of challenging. Do you have in other words, you might think it's just the intervention affects the skills, the thetas, but not the loadings. But that just seems to make your identification harder. But you must have a good reason for wanting to make those depend on the treatment as well.
Well, the reason is, and this is something that I think is important to carefully specify. There's a reason for it, and that is that we think, okay, the factor loadings we can think of as like technologies. So for a given level, so we can think of that, we can think of the intervention as actually affecting not only skills, but the way you use those skills. And so literally, that's an old distinction. It goes back actually to Finus Welch's old paper on education and production, 50, 60 years ago, that paper. But it really is the distinction that shows up a lot in the agricultural production literature and so forth. It's the efficiency of using the inputs versus changing the inputs. So that's the reason for doing so. And now you're right, it is challenging. If we just estimate the bundle, it's much less demanding. But we can estimate it given the fact that we have multiple indicators across, even for the same D, multiple indicators across items that we can identify theta. However, and this is one of the Achilles heel of the whole enterprise, which has motivated us to look at this other paper, we do have to make normalizations. I'll show you what they are. But that's the motivation, John. Is that okay? I mean, does that answer your question?
That's a very good answer. I think you clarified it. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that is now here that they'd like to ask?
Yeah, no, we're willing to take questions. We're willing to stay all night. I mean, you guys, it's early for us. So we'll buy the beer.
We're also watching the Zulip chat, but so far, go ahead. Yeah, this is very clear, very clear.
Okay, fine. So this is a very simple, but the key econometric exercise is the fact that we have multiple items. And so it's more than just the ordinary discrete choice model or threshold crossing model. So here's the problem with normalizations. And this has been around since, I don't know, I mean, the classic paper here is more than 60 years old. Anderson and Rubin. By the way, Rubin just recently died, Herman Rubin. He was about 100 years old. He was at Purdue. Classic guy, very important econometrician. Anyway, that's a side issue. So here we basically get the identification factors. The factors in factor loadings are intrinsically arbitrary, and that's just a common problem. And there's a lot of work on looking at that. Ben Williams has a fantastically good paper. I don't know if you know Ben at all. He's at, I think he's at American University, or is it George Washington University? I've forgotten. But he's in the university in Washington. He's in your neighborhood. And he's written a couple of really nice papers on alternative normalizations. And he was a student here at Chicago and sort of really contributed a lot to this, this research. So we basically allow there to be, we assume there to be an item difficulty and so forth. So we have 4 latent skills. And so here's the kind of loading that goes on. So we have these 5 latent skills, okay? And what we're gonna do is we have this factor loading. This looks very, very arbitrary. But what this is this picks one of those loads off of one component. So it's simply saying that there's one factor which loads exclusively on this. One, there can be many, many of them down to n sub j, but many, many different readings, many different measurements, but one is loaded on this, one is loaded on this, one is loaded. Now that's completely arbitrary. I completely agree. And the reason why we worry about this so much is, of course, we worry that anything we're getting out, as long as we're just interested in alpha to theta, we're okay. But we want to decompose this. It's going to depend a lot on these normalizations, or does it? So what we do is we consider a wide range of normalizations. I don't know, Jen Zhu, how many normalizations did we use altogether? Do you remember?
I think we at least try 6 to 8 different kind of combinations of like a normalization, because for each type of skills, and we know the content, and we can see, like, you know, some content are quite close with each other, and we'll say, oh, maybe for this atom, like say speak one word as the cognitive and language skill, and also maybe another atom is like speak 3 words. So they may also can be considered as the normalization like atoms. So that's why like we try different combinations. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we do is we have a number of different normalizations, and we use a procedure that's proposed by Chen, and we can go through that procedure. I don't know if people are familiar with it. It's a new estimation device, but it basically just it's basically an EML. And so I'm not going to bore you with it unless you're interested in detail. So then we can estimate estimates of beta D, and we find treatment and control groups at the baseline. So it's really a well-defined sample in terms of treatment effects. Age effects are basically the same across treatment and control group. So these are just standard effects. Now, when we estimate the item difficulty levels, we actually find something very interesting. And the item difficulty levels are really showing us that, in fact, the items do organize themselves. Remember, we're going to use items, these items or related items later on when we actually estimate the threshold, item by item, level by level in our model. That's the model we gave Thursday. But what you can see is a general pattern that the hope was that these items would gradually increase. There's general consistency with that, but it's not uniform. It's not good. Like particular in this category of social and emotional skills, things were not done very well. And so this gives us an idea of how to calibrate and estimate the test. Now, the point is, in the literature on treatment effects, there, this whole idea of measurement has not received much attention. I think it's really important. I came into this literature years ago now, looking and trusting everything the psychologists did. And now I work with psychologists, but I don't trust anything. Because first of all, the statistical standards in a lot of psychology are so low, especially social psychology, just anything goes. They're in the middle of their own revolution, attacking each other for low quality work. But on top of that, they typically are not very careful, even on these measurements. And so here, what I thought is educational psychology is a totally different story. And so what we're doing is comparing what the treatment effects would be if you proceeded in the usual way, which is basically saying no task difficulty. That's the bottom row here. These are the kinds of treatment effects that come out of the standard procedures. And then the full model, this row, is exactly what we get once we allow for the task difficulty parameter. And what we find is, even when we use things like Akiyiki and BIC, that this additional model allowing for tasks gives us different inference. Look at the gross motor effects and the magnitude of these effects relative to these effects. And certainly in social and emotional skills, we get different inference. So there really is a difference, and it makes a difference. And in fact, the model fits better. So what do we find? Well, what we can do is we can identify those skills and look at the baseline skills subject to those normalizations, both for things like cognitive and language, and then we can also do it for, so both the empirical, and so what we can see is if we look at what we call the cognitive skill, and what does that do? It picks a column of that A matrix, that alpha matrix, sorry, and takes a set of measurements and then associates the derived factor with that column. And so the language and cognitive skills are definitely shifted to the right. The CDFs are shifted to the right. If you look at social and emotional skills, also shifted to the right, the treatment group. Fine motor skills shifted to the right. We have a whole series of tests on stochastic dominance. I don't think I'm going to display those. Gross motor skills, no effect. And this shows up in a more sophisticated model later on. So what we have then is we have different effects. Now, obviously, you guys have done a lot of work on structural estimation. One way is to simply look at the treatment effect and say how much of the treatment effect, how can we reproduce the actual treatment effects with our model, because we know what the raw treatment effects are. And the answer is yes. If you compare these columns, if you just do OS and you compare our structural model, or this model, we want to call it structural, we get basically the same inference. Now, maybe it's not surprising we're using the same data, but it's a measure of the quality of the fit. But the question is, what's the source of the treatment effects? And so here we can look at this and say, look, the home visiting program could have changed its beta. That's another component of technology. You can think of these as like Cobb-Douglas, functions, if you will, if you want to think. But these are just technology coefficients. What does the program do? Does it change? It's not going to change the difficulty, the intrinsic difficulty of the test, but it is going to change possibly this math. So we're going to allow for these tests, and so we're going to define distributions that we can isolate for this, this, and this, subject to those normalizations. That's key. So then basically, if we look at the treatment effect that's reported in the literature, we can then look at each of these components. How much these come from components of X, latent skill loadings, and factor loadings. This is sometimes called the Oaxaca decomposition. I call it the Newton-Leibniz total differential rule, but whatever. And so what you can do is you can look at this treatment effect and decompose it into estimated coefficients and latent skills. And here's what we get when we do that. We find basically that there isn't much contribution that comes from the skill loadings themselves. There's some, but not much at all. The map is barely effective. Some is, but not. Virtually all of this is going to be operating through the latent skills. But here on fine motor and gross motor skills, the intervention has little effect. So actually then this tells us in the observable covariates, almost no role whatsoever. So if there's a change in the technology mapping skills to outcomes, it's mostly, it's not that, it's basically changing the skills themselves, not the map changing the skills. So the map, and so this is what we talked about before, and I'll go back to in a second. And this just shows that this program is on track with the Jamaican program. So Jin Zhu, you have some more remarks to make about these estimates and the normalizations and so forth?
I think maybe we can go back to the difficulty level parameter estimates, that chart. Just want to add one thing, like for example, if when we select the different instrument to evaluate the children's different type of skills, actually there is a quite interesting thing to see whether the instrument or the task are designed well. For example, in this Denver test, the gross motor skill actually is not designed well, because why? You can see either the difficulty level parameter is all like very, horizontal. This region, it will be like a very easy job, like the children could be easily passed, or they jump to the very difficult job. Like, so that means there's no variation to identify the children's gross motor skill. And if like later want to improve like using the instrument to identify the children's gross motor skill, the Denver test should be improved. And also similar for social emotional skill, it's either quite easy like tasks or very hard tasks. And but if you look at the language and the cognitive skill, you can see the difficulty level increase smoothly. And that is also consistent with a lot of psychology like literature, where they found like the Denver test is more in terms of detective like the children's language and the cognitive skill development compared with Bailey test. So you can see like that is also consistent with our findings. The difficulty level from our estimates is quite smoothly increased. So that means it will help us to identify the children's skills at each region. Yeah, that's it.
So that gives us some insight as to how we might want to improve the test. But
Yeah,
we can add to this the work on the other model. So I think we might want to switch to the second model, because we have some new results to the second handout. So I guess, can we go to the second handout here? Oops. I'm looking, I don't see, oh yeah, I got it, yeah. I just have to change slides here a second. Yeah, that's it. Okay, perfect, thank you. So we have then this structure. This is what we talked about last time. And I just want to review a few highlights, because everything was short and sweet. And we could probably give it in much greater detail. I could take questions about identification and estimation and so forth. So I'm not gonna go back and repeat everything that we said. There is a question though about trying to understand this technology and to escape the issues about skill and variance. When we have these latent skills, we have a whole bunch of issues that show up. And namely, that if we have arbitrary measures of skill, what do these estimates of the technology mean? And so really what we're doing is we're probing in part, not only something about the technology, but also what exactly, how to measure what those skills are, and then how much that affects our results. But as I mentioned, there are different forms of dynamic complementarity. The technology-based estimates are very sensitive to the normalizations that are used sometimes in looking at skill measurement. Freiberger has a recent paper showing how sensitive those can be, showing different normalizations and how they affect the direct estimates of the dynamic complementarity parameter. So in the paper we presented Thursday, we can see that we talked about multiple ways of testing dynamic complementarity. We were using this data set where people are entering this program at different ages, but it's the same program. It's like they're climbing a ladder, but some people enter the ladder at the very beginning of the ladder, the very lowest rungs, and others come in the middle of it. So they don't have the benefit of the previous program. So we can then examine how important that previous training was, or how much with or wasn't. And so we can do that in a way that has little to do with measuring a particular, normalizing a particular factor. And in addition, we can then look at we can look at this question by using multiple measures of skill, other than just some kind of factor extracted measure. And that's what we were doing, and we are doing in this paper. So the key notion was that investment here is going to play an indirect role. We don't measure directly what the parents are doing. I measured only at the end did we show the parents were remediating the kids who are most disadvantaged. But what we really found, what we're really doing is we're asking how much did the visitor affect the way the parent interacted. So it's an indirect kind of statement about the impact of on parenting. But the home visitor interaction with the parent or the surrogate parent is really what we can estimate here. And we do have a measure. And the beauty of what we have is it's exactly the same lesson. This came up last time, whether or not it was adapted. In this particular program, we went back and looked at it. It's not adapted. It's very rigidly taught. Now, the visitor themselves may be different in the sense of maybe apply it better or worse. And we do allow for that in some of the estimates we talked about when we did the instrumental variable estimation, because we can look at how good the visitor is, not only with this child in this province, but with other children in other counties, other villages, sorry. And so we can then discuss, use that as a way to control for ability effects of the visitor. So what we have is a good measure of I, but it's indirect. So it's not really answering this question here that's in the literature. It's answering how this other investment is stimulating parents, but it's not directly estimating that. Okay, and so what we're also doing is we're getting closer to this question about teaching parents how to be parents and giving them information. And then we're getting around this cardinality issue about the fact that there's the arbitrary scales of skill measurement. So that we talked about before. I'm not going to go through this again. We went through this already. So I'm going to go through, just to remember though, that we do have these skills that are essentially then accumulating. With each lesson plan is going to consist of different bundles. So here, for example, this is the number of tasks that a kid, when you say 8 years old, I guess, looks roughly 8 years old, is getting so many of the language tasks, not very many of these of the gross motor tasks, quite a few of the fine motor tasks, not so many cognitive tasks and so forth. Cognitive tasks increasing and gross motor tasks typically decreasing as the child ages. So there is a notion, there is a logic, but here is a kind of case of getting identification, but it's getting identification. We're making an assumption that within given levels, that the same difficulty level of skill appears. In other words, that the same skill requirement is required in each of these levels. So there are multiple tasks in each of these levels. But we're going to assume that the same competence is required within each level. So what this does is it gives us not a direct statement, but within that, we're confident that we have a constant skill. And that's by design. That's by design of these programs, these design of these task programs that were actually suggested by the psychologists that we talked about before, Hunt and the earlier psychologists that we mentioned. So that's an example. We talked about that before, and this is kind of like a typical sequence. And we do allow, and we can talk about that if you want, for there to be jumping back. Some of the psychologists will say, okay, look, here this kind of reaffirms the child. This child is now at 33 months. This child here, you see, is going to have a difficulty level 9 generally, but they drop back, kind of make sure they cement the child's understanding. So there's a general increase in difficulty, but it's not the same. It's not always monotone. For other tasks, it's almost always monotone, like fine motor and tasks, for example. So that's the key identifying assumption. So that's an assumption that is probably non-standard, but it isn't. It's a common scale across tasks within a level. Okay. So we already talked about the treatment effects. I'm not going to go through that again, except to say one of the main findings, when we look at these treatment effects, one of the main findings, and this is showing up repeatedly, both in our structural model and in the treatment effect model. And the IV is IV controlling for the quality of the visitor. So maybe some visitors are more empathetic than others. But what we find is that if we look at assessments of teaching ability of the visitor, or the interaction quality between the home visitor and the child, remember the visit's only once a week. And so the mother and the child and the home visitor together only 1 hour a week. This is the home visitor and the caregiver. And of course, the caregiver is with the child throughout the whole week. And so it makes perfect sense that in fact, there would be strong effects. And that's our indirect evidence that what we're really doing is we're affecting parenting, because it's this interaction with the caregiver that consistently shows up as the main vehicle. And you get negative effects of the grandmother presence, and that'll show up repeatedly as well. That some of these grandmothers, and both in initial conditions and in terms of the dynamic transitions effects. So we went through this very simple model. I don't think I have to repeat it for you because we did it. But what I will do is go through this general model. And let me just repeat it. Maybe the simpler model is easier to see. So just to remember what we were doing, we had this threshold crossing model, very much like what we talked about before. We have it at different ages. This is for a single level. But we define a latent human capital. We call it knowledge, but it's a skill-specific human capital. And it's going to vary across the different levels of skills. There's going to be an initial value, and that's going to play a big role. And then what we're going to get is, again, the same notion that we're using in the previous paper, that you're going to get mastery if you cross a threshold. And so we are going to be able to measure it. But the difference is, in the previous study, we're only able to measure it at certain intervals, like the midline and inline. Here, we measure it at each age, where some of the kids start as early as 6 months and stop at age 42 months. So week by week, we're getting a measure of the mastery of these skills, and different skills, I should say, all those different skills. So this is the model that we looked at before. This is the capital, human capital. You know, it's a function of previous human capital plus this thing here. We could factor in depreciation into this as well. So it's not a big deal that we don't put in depreciation per se, or appreciation. But then this is the sort of growth factor. So we think of this as the lesson, and we think of this as an ability, okay, an ability to learn. But clearly, because the model is specified this way and parameterized this way, that we cannot really separately identify these two factors, except by arguing that there is a certain component that's only ADA specific, and that ADA has an independent effect. And that could be consistent. If we think of these things as vectors, then delta could be a vector, and some subcomponents of that vector delta could be zeroed out. So self-predictivity in this very simple framework becomes this parameter here, delta eta. And dynamic complementarity is this eta parameter. And then we add random shocks. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We have random shocks. So Jinzhou, you want, this is the model with additive shocks. So let me make sure that I get this across. This is the accumulated human capital at a given age A. This is the initial condition. And this is now in front of this growth term here. Where you see here, these are the shocks that are accumulating from the time of the origin of the spell up to the age here. And you can see that the eta term is inside the exponential. This term that's essentially this power function. So as we go over ages, we're going to acquire this term here. So it's a polynomial of increasing power. And what we're getting then is moments of eta to very high power. That leads to some serious computational problems, and that causes us to limit our scope of how well this additive model fits the data. And that's going to be an issue we're going to talk about today. So then the rest of this we can just, we talked about before, except we are going to investigate this parameter, not today, but this vector case, because it makes perfect sense to think about the vector. You know, this is now allowing for appreciation, depreciation, this A term, and then allowing for skills to cross-fertilize. So somebody who's better able to read could possibly be better able also to look at cognitive, certain cognitive tasks. Why? Because they can look out and gather that type of information from the surrounding environment. So that's our general model. So I don't know, Jinzhou, I don't want to cut you off. So do you want to make some comments on the general model?
No, I mean, like, it's, I think like so far it's clear. And also John has questions for you. Yeah.
Oh, John?
Yeah. Jim, this assumption, this eta, the growth, the productivity in acquiring human capital is age invariant. I mean, doesn't neuroscience say that you've got many more synapses when you're little and they get pruned? So wouldn't that say that your ability to learn is higher? It's age dependent.
That's a very good point. And we can, to a limited extent, and I'll show you in terms of identification, we can allow that this distribution of eta to shift in the way you're suggesting. But remember, we actually are able, you know, there's some normalization, something has to be fixed. I mean, we've got to fix something here because everything's unobserved right now. So if everything, but we can't allow for that. We have yet to allow for that. And that's an excellent point, that there really is a growth in that ability. And we can't allow for that. We haven't, but we can. I mean, Jinzhou, we did some experimentation with this delta as a function of A. If you think about what we can't really separately identify the lesson from the ability in this specification. And we do allow these parameters to vary with age, right? Up to a normalization.
Delta is level specific. So that means for different difficulty level, like it will be one parameter in terms of delta. But
yeah, but it can also then change as the levels. So if you give us this notion that the brain within these limited levels is more or less fixed, we can allow for the kind of growth you were talking about, because really we're only able to estimate the product of these two. And so whether you call it ability, what you call this teaching lesson, that's an arbitrary convention, because really the enter in this.
We can add in control for eta, like for example, in terms of eta is also a function of children's age. That is so far interaction component, for example, the interaction quality and the children and also the teacher's ability, like Ignacio, like I mentioned, like because different teachers may have different ability, that also may affect the children's learning outcome. And exactly. That part also be we include that like in the eta component now. Yeah. So
yeah, so it's a partial answer. We don't have an individual growth parameter yet on the eta, though, if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, the only part we have is the initial condition for the K that is the function of like age, because different children enroll the program at different age. So that part will allow like it's you know, the age specific. But the thing
But-
is, maybe go back to John's question, the children's is really like they get the same lessons at the same weekly age. So
That's
that
the
means,
delta, yeah.
yeah, that's like every children, like when they enrolled, like when we know which task they started, actually we know their weekly age, and that's the thing. Like probably is different from other program. Yeah.
Yeah, but what he's saying is that the ADA itself should be a function of age. But we do allow the distribution of
Yeah,
ADA.
we
to
can
depend on
allow
age.
that one. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. We'll discuss this. That's a good point, John. And maybe we've been casual about it, but we do actually have that. We can definitely be more explicit because we have allowed, but let me get to the identification because you can see that.
Just, I don't want to see if anyone else has any comments at this point, right? Just, does anyone have any questions? Eric French has a question, so I'm going to bring the microphone
Sure,
back to him.
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, this is Eric French here.
Okay, good.
Really enjoying the presentation. So just in terms of what is necessary to identify ADA person by person. So in the language of what you were talking about earlier, we need both NI and NJ to go to infinity, I guess.
Oh, you're talking about the previous paper.
Although it seems like it translates to this paper as well, doesn't it?
It does. But yes.
ADA for each person that I think in the language of the previous paper, we need J to go to infinity.
Exactly. And we do, except what we're doing in this paper is we're breaking up some of those J's into finite intervals. And so instead of estimating the individual specific parameter, the kind of asymptotics that we get from the Fernandez-Val-Weidner paper won't apply because we're only going over a limited interval. And what we're focusing on now is these different levels.
Right.
And we're only doing studies within the levels. So most of our asymptotics is cross-section. So we're not really using the full panel like we were using it in the other paper.
I see. And so if that's the case, yeah, if you could just give me a little bit more intuition in terms of how you can actually identify.
Okay, yeah, give me a minute. Give me a second. We have a slide here. I will try. Whether or not we succeed, I don't know, but let me try.
Anyone has a question? Anyone else has a question? Okay, well, I think no one else is raising their hand, so you can go ahead now, Jim. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so that's the general model. We talked about this last time. So this is the set of skills taught. This is the threshold. This indicates mastery. It's just the same model as the little stripped down model, but now what we're allowing for the fact is that we have different levels at different ages, and we then actually are able to look at the structure of progress within each of those levels. And we're then going to try to connect those levels to get an idea of whether or not there's such a thing as a uniform skill level across these different models, okay? So here's the learning model we talked about before. And, so the notation is always notation is lousy to pick up, but it's A star is the last age, ASL is the first, but the age is really not an independent entity because it's also, we can specify it in terms of the skill level, the level L and the skill in particular. So that's why we call it A of SL. It's really, but it's just convenient to break in this redundant terminology. And so we talked about before looking at tests of exchangeability, and within each spell, we can then see whether or not there's any learning going on. And we saw that there was, and that sequences are backloaded, which is consistent then with the notion that there was acquisition of human capital. And I went through this example of, just an exchangeable sequence, and it's definitely not exchangeable. And we can actually find that, and when we adjust for treatment, when we adjust for maturation effects, it definitely, we find that we definitely reject exchangeability. So that we covered before. And we did cover already these different measures because we know how they do, literally age by age, skill by skill. What we can do is we can then look at things like the passing rate at each age, how well they do, and how quickly they accomplish. So here's where we do use panel data, Eric, that we are actually now able to look at the structure of the underlying model and see how much those things increase, how much learning. And here we can see learning. Definitely you see this pattern. When they get a new level, the passing rate goes down, and then it starts to go up. Then they get a new model, this goes down. This actually, some involve really new tasks, and you can see the jump down. Level 5 that we're going through. That's a hard one for these people. This one is a hard one too, level 8. And that's going to show up in terms of variances. So let me, and then we can look at cognitive tasks. And again, the different tasks vary by, and we can look at time to mastery. And this is one older measure of IQ. How quickly does it take you to master the task? And there are different measures of mastery. It can be, I measure it once, I finally understand it once, or I do it, once I do it, then I keep doing it successfully. Because remember, once they're at a level, they keep being grilled at that level until they pass on to a new level. Very mechanical. It's not the way a lot of teaching goes on, but it's the way it goes on here. And then we're able to identify ability groups, and that plays a role. And ability is one way to think about that ADA. Although really we can think of ability as something that was produced. So we can think of part of K is feeding into that ADA. The model we have now is not really accounting for that. But anyway, we can empirically look at those 3 ability groups. And we find that people are sorted this way, that about, close to 25% of the people get 80% or more on the first try. 80% of the people get the first try pass the cognitive task. That's what this is saying. And then down here, you get these people who have real problems understanding, and they're slow, they're 15%. And there's a lot of stability of this, right, Jinzu, across different groups?
Yes, and
I mean, the same people actually turn out to be fast or slow. And I remember it's within a limited age period. So it's like 3 months, 6 months to 42 months. But within that, and so we can also ask about how much you master it, time to mastery by ability. And you can ask how stable. If you get the first answer, you continue, you get an answer correct, or all the later answers correct. And so that's another measure. And we can see that these measures, while some of them are highly correlated with each other, are not perfectly correlated. For example, time to mastery versus stability. We can see it's positive, but it's not far from correlation of 1. You're getting a lot of the fine motor skill people or cognitive skill. They get there very quickly, but they're not there. They're not particularly good in terms of time passing rates and so forth. So, and then we can see the intervention again. This is the repeated theme that this interaction between the home visitor and the caregiver is really important. So, so here we can go through a series of interactions. I already covered this. I'm not going to go over it again. Let me go immediately. Oh, just to this one point though about dynamic complementarity. Namely, these children are entering at different ages. Let me just start with the, and remember, they enter at different ages, but they enter the ladder at exactly the same task that the children who previously been in the program enter. So we can see how well do these late entrants do compared to the early entrants on the same tasks. And what you see is not so good up until roughly the end of it. And at the end, things start really coming together, which suggests a kind of depreciation. Either that or the fact that tests get easier. That's always an alternative explanation. But we want to argue that in fact we think it's easier. But there's a general pattern. And this is a way to test dynamic complementarity without taking a particular parameterization of the technology of production. Gross motor tasks are totally unaffected, like we saw in the previous paper. It's just not. So this is the model. And then what we can do is we can parameterize, and we do parameterize how this model is identified. Now, let me just go through. So this is the model. Let's just take the multiplicative model. There's a separate analysis partly for the additive model, but let me take the multiplicative model to start with anyway. And this is what Jen Zhu was saying, right? That what we do is we basically can the initial conditions matter. Depends on family backgrounds, the age at which the child enters, and so forth. All of these include the environment of the family. So we initialize the process using this initial condition. And of course, any kind of skill measurement is going to need something like a baseline, an initial value of 0. And so we are going to assume, now this is the key test that we were talking about. Skill invariance means the common scale within all L. And what we do is we're saying, what does it mean, skill invariance also across L? And so the units of skill, we're going to say the initial condition for the next level of skill, say level L at skill S, and this is the first year, first age at that level, is going to be the same as the output of the previous one. That's really the skill invariance. And this is the age invariance assumption. Wiswall and Agostinelli and Pavan and Freiberger have been really emphasizing this. Flavio and I and Suzanne Chanak worried about this as well, about different ways to normalize what the measure of skill is. But here, showing the power of skill invariance, the Agostinelli-Westwall paper was very powerful in showing how important it is. And then Freiberger showing some empirical examples and some theoretical solutions, alternative solutions, or recognizing what can be identified in ordinal technologies. So what we're doing now then is testing this assumption. And that's key. But let me get the identification, because this goes back to Eric's question. I don't want to be too flippant here. So I mentioned that we were proceeding within levels. So let me just take an index within a level. So I'm being very ad hoc. I'm taking an index model straight out of a standard econometrics textbook. This is a threshold crossing model. It could be Amamiya's old book, or could be one of Motzkin's papers or something. This is a threshold crossing model. It varies though with age. So I'm giving you a very simple version of this model. The shocks, I'm going to preserve the random walk component. So these are IID shocks, we're going to assume. And we're going to assume independence between these covariates and these shocks as they come along here. And then this is the component that we were talking about identifying. On the first level, this is the lesson at level 1. And then this is the eta 1 that's in this, it's associated with the ability at that level. So that's what beta 1 is in this story. It's the product of these two objects. And one thing I didn't emphasize enough is that we're allowing those betas, those learning coefficients, to be random coefficients. Because we think that these betas, we think that's plausible. Some kids are smarter than others. And in fact, we already saw that in terms of our measures, just the time to learn, there's a lot of variation in time to learn. So we can write this index model down in a random coefficient form, but it also has this component here where we're allowing alpha coefficient A, and this is the individual heterogeneity component, and this is the random walk component. So this is the variance of this component at a given level, okay, at a given age, I should say. And so we know, and this is the standard identification argument. You can go back to Kozlet's early paper, later a nice paper by Mansky, and then work by Rosa Motzkin in the 2007 handbook chapter. We know that we can identify these index functions up to some normalization, and we can play with different normalizations, and we do that here. So that basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, look, we're going to take these normalizations, and now let me just, so we can identify these combinations. Phi, we shouldn't have a variable outside, but we can identify this constant here. This is the coefficient associated with phi, and if there's X variation, we can identify this up to some constant. Now here is where we make the normalization. And there could be other normalizations. You can normalize that the first component, that random walk component, is equal to 1. That's not so nice in this context because we're assuming IID shock. So that would sort of force those components to be the same everywhere. But we're also then maybe assuming some combination. So that's a problem, and that's always an issue. So up to this normalization, sigma 1, 1 equals 1. And 1 is really at age 1, at level 1. Otherwise, we can identify then these components relative to that normalization. That always has to be kept in mind. There's no absolute scale, only that scale. And then we can go across components. So I don't know, Eric, if that's the way this thing is getting identified, only it's obviously a little more complicated than that, because when we go to the second level, what we're doing is we're getting this index up to age A, and then we're going to basically take this random coefficient model, and this random coefficient model is then going to be a function of not only the initial conditions, which we inherit from the first level under age invariance, but we're then going to acquire this second set of terms. But remember, we've acquired a lot of information. So what we're able to do then is actually then identify what? Well, let's see. Okay, we're assuming skill invariance. And so so I don't know if that answers some of the questions here. So up to those normalizations, we can identify this coefficient here, which is on the coefficient. This is really using random coefficient technology variation. So it's using the fact that I can use, and this is the heterogeneity in ability. We didn't emphasize it last time, but we can do that in this model here. And R is just the length of time you've spent in the first spell. And this is the length of time in the second spell. And we can even identify then, up to those normalizations, the innovation variance in the first spell and the second spell. And so therefore we can allow a lot of heterogeneity. And we can also allow, for example, we can allow for the betas to be different up to scale. However, when we get to the question, it's okay. So I don't know if that answers the question, or we should amplify on it. We have a formal discussion of identification, which we can go through if you want. This is all somewhat ad hoc. Well, let me just finish the ad hoc one. And this is heuristic, I should say. It's not wrong. But if we just take this index model and take index 1, and here's the initial condition, and we assume independence here, I naught and X, independent of this shock. I'm now abstracting from the random walk. I'm just doing it level by level. But obviously the epsilon 1 is going to be the cumulative random shock. That what I can do then is from this threshold property, I can identify these things up to scale. And under age invariance, what I can assume, in other words, that I2 is a function of I1, which I identify up to scale. So heuristically, we can see how can I use that I1 up to scale? And I'm then going to use I2 up to scale in terms of I3. And so literally what I want to do is actually ask, can I test whether lambda 2 is exactly equal to 1? In other words, do I actually just transfer that up to some scale? We have a scale. So how do I identify that? This is really important though, because we can't in general identify it. Look, if I only have I1 up to scale, how the hell can I identify lambda 2? Because that's going to only be identified relative to the scale in I1. So from the second level, what can I do? I can identify beta 2 over sigma 2, okay? So then that means that's what I can identify from this procedure so far. But now we get to a key component. This is a key component. And this gets right to John's question, it gets to Eric's question. And this is where it's really important to be clear about these things. Suppose there exists one or more components of beta 2, call it beta tilde 2, such that beta tilde 2 is equal to beta tilde 1. You can see what that's going to do. That's a standard kind of model in discrete choice. That if I have the same coefficient appearing at level 1 and level 2, then I can get the ratio. I can get the ratio of the variances between 2 and 1. So that's going to give me an exclusion. That one exclusion. It doesn't have to be the whole component, but it could be something like some common component that's the same across the growth rate of level 1 and level 2. Without that, I'm dead, because there's no way I can test for the scale and variance, at least no way that we can see. And we can also then identify this lambda 1 and lambda 2, but only in interaction if we set the scale of beta 2. So we don't need to assume that delta 1 equals delta 2. We don't have to assume anything about the variances. So the variances can be fundamentally different. The deltas can be different across the different thresholds. But we do need some commonality in those betas across the level, at least one. You know, there it's like I need this one good regressor that and I saved the city of Nineveh or something like that. So anyway, does that answer the question, or is that just begging the question? We have a more detailed analysis of identification if you want.
Eric gives a big thumbs up. Me too. So I think you're good on that score.
Okay, good. It's a very important point though, because otherwise the trouble is with these normalizations, which are really somewhat tricky. And that's why Ben Williams' paper is so nice. He does a number of normalizations outside, including the one we use, but others outside. So let me just, oh boy, we're running low. Let me switch to the second set of slides, the last set of slides here. Hello? Yeah, I'm going to switch to the second, because what I want to show you is the comparison between the multiplicative and the additive model. And these are some results that are very much in the, oops. Yeah, let me just switch slides. I'm running out of time, I realize, so, and running out of patience probably too, talking about the same thing now for 2 days in a row, and probably nobody's that interested in China and so forth and so on, but anyway, we are. All right, so here, this represents something that we want to talk about, and this is something we already discussed. So I already motivated the model. The interaction, the model, so this is our model, equation 1, the additive specification. The problem with the additive specification is if we allow the eta to be heterogeneous, remember, we're able to estimate that omega parameter. That's the random coefficient associated with ability. The distribution of that can shift across levels. So to answer John's question, yes, we can allow ability to increase with age. In that sense, we're estimating a distribution. We're not estimating the individual specific parameter level. And then the multiplicative specification is this thing here. So so let me just show you some results. I'm going to compare the multiplicative with the language. This is a problem. This is a seminar. It's supposed to be teaching people, students. So we're going to let a little bit of dirty laundry air out here in order to get your feedback as to how to proceed. And we have some ideas, and we'll show you what we think is important. But let me just point out that econometrically and computationally, this model here with the random coefficient eta is very difficult to estimate. Very, very difficult. Because if you remember the term, I don't bring it here, I should have brought it forward, that you get a power in the eta. And that's difficult. So now we're going to pick up all those different moments in eta. It's possible to identify, and those different moments help identify it, if anything. But nonetheless, we didn't do that. And so the additive specification we're going to talk about is going to treat this as a constant, and the multiplicative is going to treat it as a random variable. So we're really comparing, in some sense, apples and oranges. But there are some advantages. And so how much more time do I have? 5 minutes or what?
Well, we're supposed to end at 6:15, but if you take 5 more minutes, then we have time for some questions. We have some big picture questions from others.
Okay, so good. So let me just go through this quickly then. So the real question is the additive versus multiplicative model. And I'll just go through the language skill study here. So for example, we want to estimate this. We showed how to test for age invariance and that skill invariance. And scale invariance, what we find is the additive version with scale invariance gives us a chi-square fit of 21.5. The multiplicative version is given 36. So in that sense, quote, it's worse. And it has the same number of parameters. Even though we stifled one parameter, the multiplicative version picks up another. These are fundamentally non-nested models. So this is only an heuristic. This is not proving anything by itself. We can also look at model fit. So the additive versions generally do better. Multiplicative versions easy. So if you just look at how well we're fitting, the additive model fits the language tasks, we can see it's doing pretty well, even with scale and variance. But you can see there are moments here, there are periods here, like on task 7, and these tasks here where it's really not hitting as well. The yellow dots are the orange dots, I'm sorry, are the data, and the other model, the blue line, is the fit. And so that's, and if you look, for example, with the multiplicative model, you say, holy moly, look at this. We're really missing this here. You know, the data we're showing a big dip here, and it's not true. And early on, we're doing okay. And we're doing pretty good, but you can see that we're evening things out. I mean, this data here is a lot different from what this doesn't look so good. Now, when we get rid of scale and variance, we can see we're actually doing quite well with the additive model. And in terms of goodness of fit with the multiplicative model, sorry, let me grab it here. We're actually doing much, much better, but we still do some missing here. So that's suggestive. And if you look at language tasks, for example, we can fit level by level, and we can see that the scale and variance additive is doing pretty well, but it's not exactly hitting it. And the multiplicative model really isn't at all. So we can then say, okay, look, we can compare these models. And I realize it's a huge burden to ask you to visually compare hundreds of graphs right now. We have compared it. The multiplicative model isn't so terrible, though, if you look at it, way off at the beginning. And we can start asking sort of which questions does it do well on. Without scale and variance, we're doing pretty well, okay? And so we can see that generally speaking, we think, but it depends on the skill. And so that's why we can go through and look at the tasks and the shocks. And we went through all this last time, so I don't think I'm going to go through it. However, when we compare the additive and the multiplicative models, and this is a question now of two non-nested models, and with introducing the shocks to learning in different ways, you're getting somewhat different inference. Look, this is suggesting a really strong learning component here at level 6. And here it's okay, but nowhere near. And 5 really is hard, as estimated by the multiplicative model. It's still hard here, but nowhere near the sharp decline. And so even though there's a general agreement, it's far from a uniform agreement. And so if we look at the passing rate for the multiplicative model, we can see it's not so bad. It's not so bad, but it, you know, but by the way, I would point out that in a lot of the structural estimation I've seen, this is a point I've made for 40 years, since John was a graduate student at MIT and I first laid eyes on it. And that is, it's awfully easy to fit moments. You know, finding that you fit moments is child's play. The real question is fitting entire distributions, and then fitting distributions, or at least moments, conditioning on lots of different variables. And so frequently a lot of the structural work says, oh, I fit the first 5 or first 20 moments, and it's awfully easy to do it. Here, we're actually trying to fit levels. We're trying to fit growth rates. And we see tremendous, we see some do better than others. And so here's the evidence, though, on the skill invariance property. And we can see that the age invariance property, this is what we showed last time when we were looking at the multiplicative model. This is, now let me get it side by side. Whoops, where do I have it? Yeah, here it is. So if I have the additive and multiplicative model, this is suggesting that we were pretty good on scale and variance, at least in terms of the remember, we had this affine transformation. Beta naught was the intercept, beta 1 was the slope. And beta naught 0 would be consistent with the skill invariance hypothesis. And what we find here is, yeah, beta naught's pretty close to 0, except for this really tough question 6 and 7, which then doesn't seem to do so good. But over here, if you look at the additive model, you can see that, remember, it's supposed to be 0. It's wildly rejecting skill invariance. So depending on the specification of error, this is making a very strong statement. Now, if you ask, what about the slope beta 1? 1 is the baseline. What we find is that the additive model is certainly happy with beta 1, but it definitely wants to depreciate or appreciate the inherited skill from the previous level. Here, the beta 1 is not really rejected. Here, it's rejected. Uniform confidence intervals would not reject. Here, we're going to get something that definitely looks like a rejection. But for most of the intervals, it's not. So again, uniformly, we probably wouldn't reject. But so this is a very, very different stochastic specification. And I don't know if we can, I think probably you're not interested in looking at this, but the story with the additive, let me just compare the additive and multiplicative and then stop. Here again, we can see the additive model with scale invariance is doing pretty good job, but hardly good job here. I mean, it's off. It's definitely off. And then if we look at this, look, same kind of problem. We're just, the data are here and we're showing this big jump. So this is the model showing the jump, not the data showing the jump. So this is a serious issue here. And then if we relax scale invariance, the additive model is doing pretty well, a little bit better. And the multiplicative model is doing pretty well, but there's still this period on level 5 that's not doing so well, and so forth. So we make these comparisons, we have this issue. I'm sure John has instructed you how you can choose among non-nested models, but the fact of the matter is that it makes a big difference, is what I'm saying, is whether it's an additive or multiplicative specification, and in terms of your inference on scale invariance. And it's far from obvious which one it should be. However, when you look at something like fine motor skills, what we find is the multiplicative model is doing pretty well, certainly without skill invariance. It looked like it wasn't doing so well in terms of R squared and so forth. But we're comparing an R squared here of something like 26.75 with 26.67. It's really a horse race. You can't really say it's a horse race with a tie at the deadline. And then we look at the skill, a fine motor skill, we get different. So we're not getting uniform agreement, but it does look like we're getting multiplicative, we're getting additive model being good for certain skills and multiplicative model for other skills, which is not very satisfying, and so forth. So I will stop because over time and so forth. And we can go through some of the proofs though, but you say they're big picture questions, and I'll be happy to try to take them if I can. Or ask Jen Zhu if she wants to add anything.
Well,
sorry, I've been.
I want to just thank you, again, for a really interesting talk. And I just want to let you hear the audience reaction.
Oh, they're happy that we're through. Well, have a good beer on me. I'd like to say drinks are on me, but I don't know how many of you are. So I'll skip the drinks on me phrase.
Yeah, well, there's going to be drinks and pizza, but if you heard, there was a big
pizza in Germany. Wait a minute. No. You're supposed to have Wurst, right?
But I'm going to hand it over to Philip Eisenhower. He's got some big picture questions that I think that you might want to consider.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering if when you were discussing, now focusing on the results from the China evaluation, those results with the program administrators, did they line up roughly with what they had in mind when designing the curriculum? So for example, what the relative importance or relative success of the intervention is on the different dimensions of skills for the impact?
No, and you see what's interesting, and in fact, we have an econometric test, if you will. let me see if I can get just an example. I'm trying to pick one at random. So I'm not trying to waste your time with slides. I just want to get some statement on passing rates. Yeah. See, the idea is that here's an example. Cognitive task, that's too few here. Look at, that's pretty good actually. Yeah, here, look at this. This is cognitive tasks at level 7. Okay, this is good. This is a good example. So the idea of these task order is you're supposedly, you're testing this, and there's some notion that you're supposed to be able to maybe make the tasks a little bit harder, or at least you're testing the same thing. And there really is, since the passing rates vary. When we looked at the difficulty parameters, we could see that some of them were not discriminating very well. And so therefore that suggested going back and reworking the test, reworking the test, like for example, on the gross motor skill. So Gen Zhu, I don't know if they actually responded to our response in going forward with the next study.
Yeah, I think like because the data we analyze is really mainly based on the Jamaican Reach Up and the Learn curriculum. So it's just mainly like adapt the English version to the Chinese version, like in terms of content. But now like the local and also the CDRF, like they also bring up the question is whether like this curriculum is the perfect curriculum, and whether we need to improve the curriculum. And at least based on our studies, and we can find like there is some kind of space to improve the curriculum. And CDRF probably will organize a conference and try to collect all the the experts and to discuss how to have the updated version of curriculum and for this program, because they want to like extend this project into different provinces, like in rural China. Recently, they already have like more than 10 sites in China. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is we've taken as given the structure of these questionnaires, and these are very commonly used. This is not, when we refer to these people, Hunt and to Uzgiris and to some of these earlier pioneers, those scales have been used since 1960s. They were pioneered originally in Harlem, actually, for disadvantaged children, and taken around the world. And there's a whole discussion about the scale and recognizing the arbitrary nature of the scale. And it gets right to the heart of what's meant by learning. And so the answer is, right now, there's a legitimate issue about what the appropriate way to entice learning is. There's a lot of work about just feedback learning now, where you actually, instead of fixing the lesson, you do what many lessons do anyway. If you can answer the question easily, then you speed up and you get the next test and the next. Those accelerated tests are more common. The same thing is true about accelerated curriculum. And so with the curriculum that's being developed, and we're hoping to develop it with a group in Shenzhen, with a group of people doing AI actually in Shenzhen. What we're finding is that some hope is to actually come up with an adaptive curriculum where we can then have like a feedback loop and follow what that would be. But that's underway, and we have nothing to report on.
So even from our analysis, see like the language task, like the difficulty level 5, that is very hard. Like when the children like from level 4 to jump to the level 5, almost all the children's like their performance are very bad, like including the high ability and the low ability. All of them like now to like pass the tasks. So that means like that, for example, that will be one part, like if you want to update the curriculum, maybe like that will be the part, like whether we should introduce that hard task like that early, or whether we need to add some transition task like before the difficulty level 5. So I totally agree. Like, and the other thing, like Professor Heckman said, like we may have some kind of more like a feedback thing, like the personalized the curriculum. the currently like all the curriculum will provide based on the children's weekly age. And later, maybe we can do things like, if the children cannot pass the difficult level, maybe say 5, and then they can look back to something like easier, and then like make sure they can understand, and then like to gradually like go to the difficulty level 5. So that will be another part, like to see whether we can design personalized curriculum. Yeah.
Well, getting to John's question last time, in terms of making this study though, which we're doing across many different data sets, the fact that this common kind of evaluation criterion is used is going to make easier to determine this external validity question about whether or not this produces similar growth rates in different environments. And because literally one of the problems with a lot of these, you see all these studies of meta-analysis, many of which are total junk because they're comparing studies that use totally different measures on totally different populations, and they come up with an effect and they aggregate it using some arbitrary statistical rule. Here, we have the same curriculum and more or less the same measuring instrument. Now, the circumstances vary, but that at least controls some important dimensions of those comparisons. That's just not appreciated. You see these meta-analyses anyway. I mean, that's a side issue. But so there's a sense in which we think we can improve the curriculum. There's another sense in which we're really pleased that it hasn't been changed all that much because it allows us to compare. We think now we get as many as 10 or 12 different studies in terms of growth trajectories, although none have the detailed data we talked about today. They do have data, but at more infrequent intervals in the life of the child. And then, of course, the obvious thing is to say, how well do these predict later life? And we're going to follow these kids into school and then fortunately on into college and so forth. So, and right now they're just little kids.
Okay, well, thanks so much. It was really, really great to have you. It's an honor for us, and this is a really, really informative set of lectures.
Well, I hope so. I'm probably overdid it. I think some of your talks are really, I mean, I'm looking at some of them. I'm going to be able to, they're online, right? So I can basically get them. And so I'm going to look forward to some, the time zone difference wasn't favoring my participation to the extent that it would have been had I been there and present at the seminar. But I hope we'll have another such conference, not too distant future. And so I appreciate the opportunity to participate. And I really thank Philip and Hans and certainly John for taking the time to organize this. These are important people who are speaking in these different events and the lectures and what I've seen so far is really quite interesting.
Well, thanks very much. And we are doing our own treatment interventions with the students here. We're trying to provide enhanced feedback. They've been making very interesting presentations, and we're trying to give them some helpful feedback along the way.
Oh, that's good. Okay, very good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and enjoy your Saturday. And thanks for dropping in. And
well, thanks for inviting me. So good luck and have some good beer.
okay.
Right. Take care.